In more than 4 decades of artistic activity, Andy Garcia has built a career that any actor would have to respect, with a series of roles that have left a strong mark in Hollywood film history. He is widely known through the role of Vincent Corleone in The Godfather Part III, a role that earned him an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor, elevating his name to the ranks of solid actors of the 1990s. After that, he continued to affirm his position through many standout films such as Ocean's 11 and its sequels, where he transformed into a powerful businessman with a cool demeanor, creating an iconic image of sophistication and control. In addition, he also left his mark in works like When a Man Loves a Woman or The Untouchables, proving his diverse acting ability from inner depth to dramatic intensity. Not stopping at acting, he also tried his hand at the roles of director and producer, especially with The Lost City, a heartfelt project tied to his Cuban roots. These contributions helped him receive many nominations for major awards, such as the Golden Globe, Alma Awards, and especially a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, affirming his position as a resilient, talented artist with lasting influence in the American film industry. But behind those achievements is a journey full of silences that few people see. A life divided from very early on, when he had to leave his homeland Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, carrying with him a feeling of being uprooted and not fully belonging anywhere. Growing up in America, he was not completely American, but he was no longer Cuban either, and that identity struggle followed him throughout his life, seeping into every gaze, every role. In Hollywood, he faced silent prejudices, being limited to role molds he did not choose. And even though he had proven his ability, he was still often placed in the position of almost enough rather than the most deserving. The heartfelt project, The Lost City, where he poured his memories and pain about his homeland, did not receive the recognition it deserved, leaving a void that was hard to fill. However, what makes him different does not lie in what he has achieved, but in the way he continues to move forward, holding firm to his family, holding firm to his personal values, and staying true to himself in a world that always demands change, as proof that sometimes the greatest strength is not victory, but not losing oneself. Please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to acknowledge a man who has devoted his entire life but has never been seen fully. Because the story behind the spotlight of Andy Garcia is not success, but the losses he has quietly carried throughout his life, the story of a man standing in the spotlight but never fully seen. So to understand why Andy Garcia became the person he is, we must go back to the time when everything in his life was shaped while he was not yet old enough to realize it. He was born in Havana, into a family with a stable foundation, where life was not a daily struggle for survival, where the future seemed to have a clear path ahead. But all of that disappeared almost in the blink of an eye when the Cuban Revolution took place, an event that not only changed the fate of a nation, but also completely erased the familiar life of his family. At that time, Andy Garcia was still too young to understand what was happening. He could not know that the tense conversations among adults, the worried eyes, the hasty decisions he witnessed were actually signs of an irreversible collapse, and he could not understand that the trip his family was preparing was not a temporary journey, but a permanent separation from the place where he was born. His family was forced to leave Cuba, leaving behind homes, property, friends, and a life that once belonged to them, carrying very little, almost nothing except memories that over time would become faded for a child, but became a deep pain for the adults in his family. When they set foot in Miami, they were not just immigrants seeking opportunities, but people who had lost part of their identity, forced to start over in a world they did not fully understand. And for Andy Garcia, even though he was too young to remember the details, that sense of loss still seeped into him in a way that was hard to explain. Growing up in Miami, he learned to adapt to a new environment, learned to speak a different language, learned to live by rules he was not born to understand. But right from the early years of adulthood, he carried within him a feeling he could not explain, a feeling that he always stood on the edge of everything, that no matter how hard he tried, there was still an invisible gap between him and the world around him. He did not have clear memories of Cuba to recount as a complete story. He could not describe in detail the streets or the days that had passed. But that did not mean Cuba did not exist in him. On the contrary, it existed like a shapeless longing, a feeling of lack that he could not name, a part of himself that he knew had been lost before he had the chance to understand what it was. Other children grew up with a clear answer to the question, "Where do I belong?" While Andy Garcia grew up with a void between two worlds, where he was no longer fully Cuban, but had never felt completely American. And that very contradiction quietly influenced the way he saw himself, the way he stepped into life, and later, the way he stepped into Hollywood. In an industry where identity is often simplified into easily recognizable molds, he could not easily place himself into a specific image because he himself was not sure which image he belonged to, and that made his journey more difficult in a way that not everyone realized. He not only had to prove his talent like any other actor, but also had to face a deeper question. A question that no role could answer for him, which was who he really was in this world. And perhaps the most painful thing was not that he left Cuba when he was too young, but that he carried that sense of loss throughout his life, like a void that could not be filled, like a memory without specific images to hold on to, a deficiency that no success, no fame, no recognition could completely erase. It was from that starting point, from a separation he had no right to choose, from a childhood interrupted before clear memories could form, that the person Andy Garcia was shaped, not by what he had, but by what he had lost. And perhaps that very thing followed him throughout his later journey, making him a person who always walked between two worlds, always searching for a place to belong, but never truly finding it. And if Andy Garcia's childhood began with a separation he could not understand, then his body carried another mark. A mark that made him realize early on that he was not like those around him, even when he was not yet old enough to name that difference. He was born with a rare defect, a benign tumor that developed on his shoulder, with such an unusual shape that doctors had to perform surgery to remove it when he was very young. And although the surgery was successful, it still left a scar that could not be erased. A trace that over time existed not only on his body, but also imprinted deeply into the way he saw himself. For others, it might have been just a medical detail, an incident resolved very early, but for a child growing up with the feeling of not belonging anywhere, carrying a sign of difference, made the gap between him and the world around him even clearer, in a way that no one spoke of, but he always felt, while other children ran and played carefree, without thinking about their bodies. Andy Garcia gradually formed a quiet awareness that something was not completely the same, that his body had once been a problem that needed to be fixed. And even though no one mentioned it, it was still there like a wordless reminder. He was not the type of person who would recount this story to seek pity, nor did he turn it into part of his public image. On the contrary, he kept it to himself, just as he kept many other things in his life, and that very silence made the scar not only a physical mark, but a part of his inner self. In his adult years, the feeling of incompleteness did not come from not being able to do something, but from always being aware that he had once been incomplete, a bodily memory he could not erase, and that quietly influenced the way he stood, the way he moved, the way he presented himself to others, as if there was always a part of him trying to hide something that no one really saw. There were no big conversations about insecurity, no clear confessions, only a gradual withdrawal, a tendency to keep distance, a habit of observing more than revealing, and over time, that was no longer a reaction but became his personality. He was not loud, did not seek to become the center of attention, did not enter a room with the desire for all eyes to turn to him. And perhaps part of that stemmed from the years when he learned to exist without needing to be seen too much. When he stepped into acting, this became a paradox, because cinema is a place that demands strong presence, demands the ability to occupy space. But Andy Garcia brought a different kind of presence into it. Quieter, more reserved, as if he always held back a part of himself that he did not allow the world to touch. His gaze on screen had depth, not because he tried to create it, but because he had become accustomed to holding back things left unsaid. And that very silence created the weight that audiences felt but could not easily explain. The scar on his shoulder over time might no longer be something others noticed, but the feeling of difference it once created did not disappear. It only changed form, becoming a reserve in the way he stepped into the world, a distance he kept from others, and an unspoken need to prove that he deserved to be there, not because he lacked ability, but because he always carried the memory that he had once not been completely like the others. And perhaps it was from the combination of a rootless childhood and a body that once carried a mark of difference that the person Andy Garcia was formed in a very unique way. Not loud, not revealing, but full of depth. A person who learned to endure in silence, learned to exist without needing to explain, and carried all of that into every step afterward as an inseparable part of himself. In the years that carried the feeling of difference in silence, Andy Garcia gradually searched for something that could help him escape the invisible gap between himself and the world around him. And for many young people, especially in an environment where they had to learn to fit in, sports often became the clearest path, a place where everything was measured by effort, by achievements, by what you could do instead of who you were. For Andy Garcia, baseball was not just a sport, but an opportunity for him to feel like he belonged to a collective, a team, a place where he did not need to explain his past, his origins, or the feelings that were hard to name that had followed him since childhood. On the baseball field, no one asked where he came from. No one looked into the voids in his identity. All that mattered was how fast he could run, how accurately he could hit the ball, what he could contribute to the team, and, for a period of time, that brought him a rare feeling he had never had before. The feeling that he had a position, that he was recognized for what he did, not for what he lacked. He devoted time, effort, and even faith to that path, not like a dream drawn from childhood, but like an opportunity to escape the sense of being lost that had quietly existed in him throughout his early years. But just like many other things in his life, when the path began to take a clearer shape, when he began to believe that he could go further, that he could build a future based on his own effort, then something he could not control happened. And this time, it did not come from external circumstances, but from his own body. A hepatitis illness appeared, without warning, without giving him time to prepare, without leaving him any choice. And in a very short time, everything he had built around sports was forced to stop. It was not a failure due to lack of effort. It was not a loss that could be learned from and returned to, but it was a full stop that he had no right to change. A door that closed not because he was not good enough, but because he no longer had the ability to continue. For a person who had become used to striving to prove himself, losing the only path that brought a feeling of belonging was not just a change in direction, but a quiet shock, a new void appearing on top of the old voids. When sports was no longer an option, he had no clear backup plan, no second dream waiting. And for a while, he fell into a state that many young people have experienced, but rarely talk about, a state of being lost, where you do not know where you will go, you are not sure what you can do, and you begin to doubt your own value. Questions began to appear, not loud but persistent, whether he was really good at anything, whether he could become someone, or whether everything he had was just efforts that were not enough to take him anywhere. There were no clear answers, no guide, only time and silence, and it was in that period that another path began to appear. not like a grand dream, but like a vague possibility, something he could try, could explore, but was not sure where it would lead. Acting came to Andy Garcia, not like a certain choice, not like a passion nurtured from childhood, but like a door that opened while he no longer knew which way to step, a path he entered with more questions than answers. At first, it was just an experiment, a way for him to regain the feeling of controlling his life, a place where he could try to become someone else, could step out of the limits he felt within himself. But the deeper he went, the more he realized that acting was not just transforming into a character, but also a way for him to confront the very things he had kept inside, the emotions he did not speak about, the voids he could not fill, the questions about identity that he had no answers for, all found a way to exist on screen, not like direct explanations, but like deeper layers in the way he portrayed characters. However, at that time, there was nothing to guarantee where this path would lead him. No signs that he would become a recognized actor. No one promised that he would find his place in a harsh industry, and that made his steps more fragile than ever. He did not enter acting with the certainty of someone who knew he belonged there, but with the reserve of a person who had once lost the only path he trusted and did not want to face that feeling again. But perhaps that was exactly why he continued, not because he was sure of success, but because he had no other choice, and in that uncertainty, in those unclear steps, a new journey began, a journey not built on absolute confidence, but on something much simpler, that he still kept moving forward, even though he did not know where it would lead. But stepping into acting did not mean that Andy Garcia had found a place where he was truly accepted, because Hollywood, with all its glamour, was a world that operated on very clear templates, where people looked not only at talent, but also at which image you fit into. And in the early years, Andy Garcia was not a name welcomed as a big potential, but a person who had to stand outside the door, knocking one beat at a time, waiting for an opportunity that many times never came. He participated in auditions again and again, faced head shakes, short rejections, quick evaluating eyes as if people had decided who he was in just the first few seconds. And the pain did not lie in the fact that he lacked ability, but in the fact that he rarely had the chance to prove it. When the first roles appeared, they were not roles that opened up depth, but roles that framed him into an image Hollywood was familiar with, a Latin man with a stern appearance, sometimes dangerous, sometimes cold, often tied to the world of crime, with templates that had been repeated so many times that there was no room left for difference. It was not that he could not do those roles well, on the contrary, he did them excellently. But that very thing became a loop, because each time he performed well, Hollywood became even more convinced that was all he could do, and became even less willing to give him other opportunities. In an industry where many actors were built as diverse icons, given the chance to try many types of roles, Andy Garcia was kept in a safe zone he did not choose, as if his path had been drawn in advance without asking for his opinion. He tried to change that, tried to bring more into each role than what was required, adding layers of emotion, gazes, silences that he hoped would make others realize he could do more, that he was not just a simple image. But those efforts were not always seen, and were often overshadowed by the way the system viewed him from the beginning. There were times he stood before difficult choices, accepting familiar roles to continue existing in the industry, or waiting for another opportunity that no one guaranteed would come. And in many cases, he did not have full choice, because to survive, he needed to work, needed to appear, needed to maintain his presence, even if that meant continuing in the templates he wanted to escape. This created a prolonged feeling of contradiction when he knew he could do more, but there was no space to prove it, when he felt the depth within himself, but was asked to show only a small part of it. And over time, that not only affected his career, but also touched the way he saw his own value. No one said directly that he was not enough, but the way he was used, the way he was limited, the way he continuously had to prove himself from the start, all created an implicit message that he could not help but hear, that he had to try harder to be recognized like others, that he had to prove what others were automatically granted. In the silent moments between roles, between auditions, between times waiting for the phone that did not ring, that question returned, not loud but persistent, whether he really belonged here or whether he was just existing in it because there was no reason yet to be completely eliminated. And perhaps what made this period heavy was not the number of times he was rejected, but the feeling of being misunderstood, being seen in a simpler way than his true self, being placed in a mold he had no chance to break, as if he always had to start over from the beginning every time he entered a new room, every time he stood before a new opportunity. But even so, he did not stop, did not leave the path he had stepped onto. Because deep inside, even though doubted, even though limited, he still believed he had something worth being seen. And that quiet belief, not loud, not spoken, kept him in a world that seemed to have never truly trusted him. And then, after all those years of being rejected, being limited and being seen incompletely, the opportunity Andy Garcia had been waiting for finally appeared. Not loudly, not announced in advance, but big enough to change the way the world looked at him. When he was chosen for the role of Vincent Corleone in The Godfather Part III, a part of one of the greatest film legacies in America, it was not just a role, but a door he had been knocking on for many years that finally opened. An opportunity for him not only to appear, but to truly be seen, to be evaluated, to be placed in a space where his depth could exist. When the film was released, audiences began to realize what he had been trying to prove for a long time, that he was not just an image, not just a template, but an actor capable of bringing complexity, tension, and emotional depth. And that recognition was made concrete by an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor, a milestone that many people have to spend a lifetime to achieve, if they can achieve it. In that moment, it seemed like everything finally converged. The years of waiting, the rejections, the quiet efforts, all seemed to be answered with an affirmation that he truly deserved it, that he was not a name standing on the sidelines, but a part of the center. But right at that point, that seemed like the peak, another truth began to emerge, a truth not easy to recognize immediately, that this success came at a time when Hollywood no longer saw him as a new discovery, no longer willing to build him as a long-term central face. And even though he had proven his ability, the system he stepped into did not change the way it operated just because of one excellent role. After The Godfather Part III, he continued to work, continued to appear in many projects, continued to show stability and professionalism, but the path that many expected, the path that would make him a leading star with consecutive main roles, did not open that way, as if he had touched the door of that position, but was not invited to step in completely. There was a hard-to-accept paradox in this period, when he had achieved something that very few people could achieve, but could not turn it into a sustainable position in the industry. As if he had climbed to the top of a hill only to realize that there was still another gap ahead that he was not allowed to cross. Others, at other times, might have used such a role to redefine their entire career, but for Andy Garcia, it was only enough to change the way he was seen in the moment, not enough to change the way he was placed in the system long term. He did not become the first choice for big projects, was not built as a new icon, and gradually, the familiar feeling returned, the feeling that he was still standing near the center, but not in it, that he had achieved something very big but could not hold it long enough to turn it into a foundation for the next steps. This did not come as a sudden shock, but as a slow realization, bit by bit, through each project, through each opportunity that did not come, through each role not given, that even though he had proven who he was, that did not mean the world would treat him differently. And in that silence, in the time after the spotlight of The Godfather Part III, Andy Garcia had to face a feeling that was very hard to name, not failure, because he did not fail, not being forgotten, because he was still present, but the feeling of achieving something great, but not being able to keep it, as if he had touched another version of his life, a version where he could become a central star, but only in a brief moment before it passed. And perhaps what made this period heavy was not what he did not achieve, but the fact that he had clearly seen what he could achieve, had touched it, and then had to continue moving forward knowing that he would never completely return to that point again. And after experiencing The Godfather Part III, Andy Garcia stepped into another phase in his career, where success had knocked on the door but had never completely belonged to him. He participated in big projects, films that audiences remembered for a long time, works that featured the names of Hollywood's top stars, but rarely was Andy Garcia the main character. Rarely did he have the opportunity to stand in the center of the story and become the focus of all eyes. In Ocean's 11 and its sequels, he was the powerful, sophisticated face, but always appeared alongside more prominent stars, names that were already familiar and favored, making his image, though memorable, still not completely capture the audience's emotions. Many of his roles left a deep impression, were highly praised, but never created a dominating position, never turned him into the character that the public would remember first. His career therefore became a series of moments of almost reaching the peak, excellent roles, memorable scenes, but always standing on the edge of the spotlight. One side recognition, one side incompleteness, making him always have to prove his value every day, every role. This feeling was not only personal disappointment, but also a quiet pressure when he realized that even though he had done everything he could, even though he had brought all his heart and inner depth into each role, the position he deserved was not always there. Even the projects where he was given important responsibilities were not enough to change the way Hollywood viewed him, and he had to learn to accept that he would always be the person standing near the center, but never in it, the person who appeared to support the story, but not the center that shaped it. And in each shot, each dialogue scene, Andy Garcia learned to bring into it all his identity, all his loneliness, all the perseverance he had carried from Cuba to America. From his lost childhood to the first years stepping into the film industry, he turned his limitations into energy, turned the feeling of being placed on the edge of recognition into motivation, so that every role was complete, every gaze, every gesture contained the story of a man who had gone through so many losses but still stood firm. But this was not easy at all, because each time he appeared, each role, he had to balance between the expectations others placed on him and the limits the industry imposed. And sometimes that very thing made the feeling of loneliness increase, because even though he was recognized, he still knew that he had never been given the full position that his real talent deserved. In the thin gap between light and shadow, Andy Garcia continued to build his career, stepping forward with quiet perseverance, not loud but steady, turning every role, whether small or standing beside others, into his own mark. A way to say that he was present, that he had value, that even if Hollywood might not have completely given him the opportunity, he still proved he could not be overlooked. And from those years, his image became more complex, both powerful and quiet, both prominent and humble, a unique combination that made audiences realize that Andy Garcia was not someone who had failed, but someone who always stood on the edge, but still kept himself, still left his own mark in every film, in every moment, even if he was not always the center that the public remembered first. In each gaze, each gesture, each role, he told the story of a man who had overcome the invisible gap between talent and opportunity, between recognition and limitation. And no matter if Hollywood might never have completely trusted him, Andy Garcia still kept going, stepping forward steadily, with a quiet belief that real value did not lie in the central position, but in the way he expressed himself. Whether standing beside or standing in the light, he was still someone who could not be erased. And in the years standing near the center but never completely occupying the position, Andy Garcia realized that his career was not only limited by the templates that Hollywood imposed, but also by the choices he himself had to make, the difficult decisions between adapting to be recognized and keeping his own identity that he never wanted to trade. He did not accept changing himself just to fit the system, did not turn himself into an image that the industry wanted to see, even if that meant many big opportunities would pass by without being grasped. He knew that if he wanted to survive and continue in the profession, he could completely chase attention-grabbing strategies, participate in scandals to appear on newspaper pages, or turn himself into a loud star like many others had done. But that was not the path he chose, because what was more important than anything was preserving his personal values and honesty with himself in a fiercely competitive environment. The roles he received were not always the center, but he always brought into them all the depth, all the feelings, all the experience and memories, to prove that his talent and qualities did not depend on whether he was favored or not. That quiet choice, though little seen and little rewarded, became a characteristic of his entire career, creating a separate path, a resilient and reliable image in the eyes of those who truly observed. Refusing to trade also meant he missed many big opportunities that could have brought his name to international level faster, potential projects, powerful leading roles, even opportunities to become the name mentioned most in the industry. But he was willing to accept that disadvantage because if he had to pay the price with his own identity and principles, he knew that success would become empty and meaningless. The silence, the steadfastness, and the ability to wait for the right opportunity were what had extended his influence throughout his career, creating an Andy Garcia that people could not deny, a man who always appeared with dignity and reliability, even if not appearing loudly, even if not all eyes turned to him. And that very thing made every role, every shot, every moment on screen carry its own weight and value, expressing a man who did not lose himself in a world where many others were willing to trade everything to stand out. In these years, he learned to accept that success did not always come with satisfaction, and that there were values more important than fame or money. He learned patience, learned to wait for roles that allowed him to express himself fully, and learned to turn every limit that Hollywood imposed into an opportunity to prove that he could still shine in his own way. Even though the choice of silence and keeping his identity might make him less noticed, less honored, or less appearing on rankings, that very thing created a resilient and respectable Andy Garcia, a person who, when appearing, every gesture, every gaze carried his own story, the losses, the sacrifices, the quiet efforts that few could see. And in all those choices, he still continued to move forward, still continued to work in the profession, still continued to keep his identity and values in an industry where standing out sometimes traded for temporary fame and principles that had been overlooked. And this steadfastness was what had created an Andy Garcia who, whether standing on the edge or near the center, was always a symbol of character, dignity, and resilience in the hearts of audiences and colleagues. After the years of quietly preserving his identity and persistently moving forward between the limits that Hollywood imposed, Andy Garcia found an opportunity to tell his own story, not through forced roles or ready-made templates, but through a heartfelt personal project, the film The Lost City. This was not just a film to him, but a way for him to bring memories of Cuba, of family, of the lost childhood years, of the feeling of being placed on the edge of recognition onto the screen, turning all the losses, the longings, and the sacrifices he had gone through into a story that audiences could see and feel. He spent years developing this project, personally participating in every stage from the script, choosing locations, building images, to the smallest details on screen, as if every shot, every scene was a piece of his own memories, a continuation from the things he had experienced but had never told. Throughout that process, Andy Garcia put all his emotions into every detail, from lighting, costumes, music, to the way characters interacted, so that the film was not just a story about Cuba or family, but also a way for him to acknowledge the pains, the disappointments, the losses he had carried throughout his life. For him, the lost city was a way to stand up and say, I am still here, I have the right to be listened to, and what I have gone through cannot be forgotten. Every shot was a reminder of the divided childhood, of the pains no one saw, of the heavy expectations and the limits he had to face, and he turned all those experiences into a film that he himself saw as a way to retell his own story, like a release both mentally and emotionally. However, the journey to bring The Lost City to release was not easy at all. Hollywood did not easily welcome projects that were so personal and profound, and Andy Garcia had to face many rejections, many doubts, many worries about whether the public was ready to listen to a story with the colors of memories and identity that he wanted to convey or not. But he did not give up, because he knew this was the only opportunity to turn the losses, the loneliness, and the quiet life experiences into something that could be shared. And he poured all his faith into the idea that audiences would feel what he wanted to convey. Every day on set, every decision about shots, every interaction with actors and the crew was carefully considered by him, as if every action, every line carried a part of his own life. And in that process, the Lost City became an extension of who he was, a place where he could put his whole heart and soul, where no limits could stop him from expressing himself. Andy Garcia did not see this project only as an opportunity to prove his acting ability or directing skills, but as the way he affirmed that, despite the limits, despite the losses, and despite the years standing on the edge of recognition, he could still create a work that others could see, listen to, and feel, a work with its own mark, full of emotion, and profound enough that anyone looking at it could recognize the story of a man who had gone through many challenges to exist while still keeping his identity. Throughout the process of making The Lost City, he faced many obstacles, from financial pressure, resource limitations, to how to make audiences realize the profound meaning of the story. And each time he had to convince investors, each time he had to face doubtful questions, he reminded himself that this was not just a film, but the story of childhood, of homeland, of family, of the losses and the sacrifices he had carried throughout his life. And precisely thanks to that steadfastness, The Lost City became a project that Andy Garcia devoted his whole heart to, where his pain, memories, and longings were transformed into art, where audiences not only saw an actor, a director, but also felt a man who had overcome many challenges to exist, a man who had brought all his losses and pain into every shot, every line, every gaze, so that the film became the place where he could speak out things that had never been spoken, to prove that even if Hollywood might not have completely recognized it, his story was still worth being heard, seen, and felt. It was from this process that Andy Garcia not only created a film, but also created a living proof of the ability to turn pain into art, turn memories into stories, turn losses into a message that anyone looking at it could feel the power of faith and steadfast will. And although Andy Garcia had poured his whole heart, memories, and emotions into The Lost City, the result was not what he expected. The film, even though it contained a profound story about his homeland, about family, about his own losses and sacrifices, did not receive widespread acceptance from the public, did not achieve commercial success commensurate with the heart he had put in, and even the critics only saw the surface, and did not truly feel the emotional depth that Andy Garcia wanted to convey. This brought a feeling of disappointment that could not be shared publicly, because he did not want to turn his private pain into a reason to seek pity or sympathy from others. The years of quiet effort, the sweat, and the sleepless nights over the smallest details on set seemed not to be understood, and he had to learn to accept that sometimes, even if you put your whole heart and soul into something, the world was still not ready to listen. This feeling was both heavy and subtle. It was not like clear or public failures, but a kind of simmering, persistent disappointment, where you realize that there were values, experiences, stories important to yourself, but they could not always be forced for others to understand or accept. And that did not make them lose their value, but created a void that you had to walk through yourself. Andy Garcia gradually learned that understanding and recognition did not always come from the majority, that sometimes your greatest efforts were only appreciated by a few people subtle enough to see them. And that very awareness created the steadfastness in him, a quiet steadfastness that few saw but became the foundation for his entire career afterward. In the first days after The Lost City was released, he experienced feelings of both pride for having completed a project that contained his whole heart and disappointment for seeing the values he cherished being overlooked. And in that silence, he realized that the journey was more important than the result, that putting out the story, sharing memories and experiences, even if not welcomed by the majority, was still a way to preserve his own identity and principles. He also realized that failing to convey the message did not diminish the value of what he had created, but only reminded him that you could not always control how others perceived things, that there were things important that only you yourself could truly understand, and that maintaining honesty with yourself, keeping your own emotions and memories, was more precious than any praise or external success. This very disappointment, instead of making him collapse, became an important part in his growth process, helping him rethink the real value of art, of identity, and of what he had contributed. And gradually, Andy Garcia learned how to live with the feeling that the world did not always hear, but that did not diminish the importance of the story, did not erase the value of the effort, and did not reduce the strength of the man he was. And from this awareness, he continued to move forward, continued to choose roles that he felt suited him, continued to build his career with honest decisions, not chasing trends or temporary attention, and in each of those steps, Andy Garcia still carried the story of a man who had poured his entire life into a project that the world was not ready to listen to, but precisely because of that, he still kept himself, still kept his identity, and still was an artist who, even if few truly understood, always left an indelible mark. After the years of pouring his heart into The Lost City and witnessing his efforts not being received as expected, Andy Garcia began to step into another phase in his career, a quiet phase where he no longer hurried after opportunities or big projects like before. He gradually reduced his appearances on screen, no longer appeared densely in blockbuster films or roles that Hollywood saw as the focus, and instead selected projects that he truly cared about, roles that allowed him to express the inner depth he had accumulated over many decades, instead of roles that only served commercial goals or image. Unlike before, when each rejection, each framed role was a pressure, now he no longer tried to return to the central position of the industry that he had once wished for. He accepted the silence in his career, accepted that the public did not always see or correctly evaluate his value, and that did not discourage him, but on the contrary, became a release for himself. In that silence, Andy Garcia found a way to slow down, a way to enjoy each moment with family, to focus on raising his children, to maintain the relationships that were truly important, instead of being swept into the whirlpool of fame and external recognition. He learned to breathe more gently, to let each day pass, not as a race to prove his value, but as a way to live fully with himself and what he truly cared about. This choice did not come from giving up or disappointment, but from a profound awareness that real value was not decided by fame or temporary success, but by the way he preserved his identity, dignity, and personal principles throughout the life he had lived. In these years, Andy Garcia still worked in the profession, still appeared when necessary, but each role, each project was carefully considered, chosen according to his emotions and personal beliefs. And this approach created a different image, not loud, not pressured by the public, but more stable and complete than ever. He stepped out of the bright lights, but not to leave the film world. He stepped out to stand firm in his own way, so that each role, each shot, was no longer a chase after others' expectations, but a true expression of the man he was. That silence, although it seemed quiet on the outside, was full of meaning on the inside. A time for Andy Garcia to face himself, to reflect on the losses, the small victories, the quiet sacrifices, and to see that, even if not fully recognized, he still held his dignity, still was a steadfast man, and still was an artist who, in any moment he appeared, the light from his own authenticity was enough to make others remember. In this silence, Andy Garcia learned to cherish each opportunity, each moment with family, each story he told through acting, and no matter if the world might not always listen or understand, he still continued to move forward with the belief that it was precisely the honesty, the perseverance, and the way he lived according to his own values that made up the real person he was, a person who did not need to stand in the central position to still be seen, felt, and respected. And in the silence that Andy Garcia had chosen, he gradually realized that real value did not lie in the roles or the recognition from Hollywood, but in the simple but most important things, family and his private life. He began to spend more time with his wife and children, for quiet mornings at the family breakfast, for afternoon conversations and studying with his kids, for the ordinary moments he had once missed when caught up in the hectic pace of the film industry. In an environment where marriage was often difficult to last, where fame and glamour could easily crack relationships, Andy Garcia chose to build a solid family, a marriage that lasted for decades with Marivi Laredo Garcia, based on love, respect, and steadfastness. He did not turn himself into a father who only appeared on newspaper pages, only seen through the lens, but became a father who was truly present, a father who was there in every step of his children's growth, participating in everyday stories, from playing in the garden, swimming lessons, to guiding his children to understand the value of effort and honesty. This choice brought him a stability that stage lights or fame could not provide, a stability where he no longer had to prove himself to anyone, where success was not measured by awards or posters on the wall, but by smiles, gazes, and real connection in the family. In each moment with his wife and children, Andy Garcia found peace, a feeling of completeness that he had never felt in the years chasing Hollywood's light, where every step was tied to the pressure to prove his ability and to fit the templates he did not choose. He learned to cherish the small but precious values, shared dinners, sudden conversations, laughter, and even the silent moments together, where no one needed to act, no one needed to prove anything. This was a life he chose for himself, a life that brought deeper and longer-lasting meaning than any fame or glamour, where Andy Garcia was still himself, still kept his dignity and identity, and still left a mark in the hearts of those closest to him, those who truly saw the real person he was. In this choice, he also found a new strength to continue his artistic work. But now, every project, every role was selected and considered based on passion and personal values, instead of pressure from recognition or the need to prove himself to the public, and this balance created a more complete Andy Garcia, a man whose light no longer only shone on roles or fame, but shone on the very life he had chosen, where he truly belonged, where every step, every decision reflected the real, honest, and resilient man he had been throughout his life. And although Andy Garcia had found peace and stability with his family, he still had to face a difficult truth: to preserve his identity, hold firm to his principles, and not lose his true self. He had missed opportunities that many others might have seized to become top superstars, names that audiences immediately remembered whenever Hollywood was mentioned. Those opportunities to change his public image, potential roles, blockbuster projects that, if he had accepted the conditions or templates the industry imposed, could have taken him to the peak of fame. But Andy Garcia chose to refuse, chose to keep his true self, and that very decision meant he accepted paying the price with silence, with times when his name was not mentioned, with the media and the market not paying much attention to what he had contributed. This choice did not come from fear of failure or lack of confidence, but was a conscious decision, a steadfastness he had kept from the first years stepping into Hollywood, that he would not change his identity just to fit trends or to be recognized by the public, that he would not sacrifice his dignity or principles in exchange for temporary glamour. When looking back at the years that had passed, Andy Garcia realized that each refusal, each choice of silence, each time stepping away from a project he knew would bring fame but went against his values, were all choices that shaped his life, creating a different image, not loud, not immediately prominent, but resilient and authentic, making any role he appeared in carry a depth and spirit that was not easy to copy. He realized that real value did not lie in fame or posters on the wall, but in the way he kept himself, the way he chose to live honestly with himself, and the way he conveyed stories, memories, and emotions through each role without letting them be distorted. Even though that meant the market did not care, the media mentioned him little, audiences sometimes overlooked him, Andy Garcia still felt satisfied, because he knew that what he had kept was the most important thing: dignity, identity, and the strength of a man who had gone through many losses, many difficulties, and still had not lost himself. When looking back, he realized that the missed opportunities, the roles he could not take because he did not want to go against his personal values, and the successes that others might have achieved quickly, all created a unique identity, making Andy Garcia become an artist, respected not only for his acting, but for the way he chose to live, the way he protected himself, and what he believed was right. And in the quiet moments when there was no longer pressure from the media or from the industry, he looked back at the path he had taken, realized that each choice, even if it seemed like a loss, contributed to making the unique Andy Garcia, a man whose story, even if not fully recognized by everyone, still carried its own meaning and strength, like proof that sometimes, to keep yourself, you have to accept losing things that could bring fame. And those very losses made up the real value of life. Throughout this process, he learned to accept that not everyone would see, that not all opportunities suited him, and that keeping his true self and personal values sometimes required paying the price with things the outside world valued. But it gave him a feeling of freedom, a feeling of completeness that external glamour and fame could never bring. And that very thing made Andy Garcia become a role model, not for what he could achieve, but for what he did not lose. And although Andy Garcia had found stability in his family, had built an honest life, and preserved his own values, he still carried a deep loneliness, a feeling of not completely belonging anywhere, a void that no one could see and no one could fully feel. Even when standing under stage lights, when his name appeared on billboards, on movie posters, or was mentioned in interviews, he still always knew that the deepest part of himself, the childhood pains, the losses from Cuba, the feelings of being lost and not belonging anywhere, were never seen by the public and could not be fully shared with anyone. He lived with that truth quietly, carrying loneliness even while being recognized. And this very quietness had shaped most of the way he moved throughout his career. Andy Garcia was not someone who liked to complain or explain. He understood that what was inside him was too complex to be understood just through Hollywood's light or through short conversations with the media. Therefore, he kept the deepest experiences for himself. So they became a source of inspiration, energy, and inner motivation that helped him get through each challenge, each role, each project he chose to join. His life existed between two parallel identities. One part was the man of Hollywood, with lights, fame, and roles that audiences knew. One part was the man of Cuba, of lost childhood, of memories of his homeland, of the values he had preserved since he was too young to understand what he had lost. These two identities did not fully merge, but existed together, creating a complex Andy Garcia, both standing before the public with a sophisticated and powerful demeanor, while quietly carrying voids, pains, and deep thoughts that few could feel. Throughout his life, He learned to accept that truth without needing to explain, without needing to prove it to anyone, because he understood that not everyone would be able to listen or understand, and more importantly, he himself still existed fully, still kept his dignity, still could create art, create roles he believed in and felt meaningful. This acceptance brought Andy Garcia an inner strength that few saw, an ability to move forward steadily between the temptations of glamour and the pressures from the industry, an ability to hold firm to his identity while still performing roles that demanded depth and subtlety. Each time he appeared on screen, each shot he took part in carried wordless stories, emotions he kept hidden in his heart, experiences that only he knew and that created a weight, a profound presence that audiences felt even if they could not explain it. The loneliness he carried was not weakness, but the mark of a person who had gone through many losses, much waiting and many challenges, knowing he could exist between two worlds while still keeping his identity. When looking back, Andy Garcia realized that it was precisely the loneliness, the silence, and living with his own pains that created his depth, making an artist who was memorable not only through his roles, but through the way he existed between light and shadow, between recognition and invisibility, between two parallel identities he carried throughout his life. He did not need others to understand everything, nor did he need anyone to recognize every pain or every sacrifice, because living honestly with himself and facing those wordless truths was what made up the real value of the man Andy Garcia was. A man whose story, even if told little, was still full of strength, full of emotion, and still inspired anyone who had ever felt they did not fully belong anywhere, but still kept moving forward resiliently. In that silence, he had learned to turn loneliness into motivation, loss into inspiration, and personal experiences into art, so that each shot, each role, each moment he appeared carried the story of a man living between two worlds, without needing explanation, but still steady and complete. And that quiet completeness was what made Andy Garcia the one audiences loved and respected today. Looking back at his entire journey, Andy Garcia could not deny that his life had gone through countless losses, missed opportunities, roles that could have taken him to new heights, moments that the public and media might never fully record, and personal choices full of sacrifice to keep his identity and values. He did not achieve everything the world measured by money, by fame, or by flashy awards, but what he had gained was deeper, more enduring, and carried longer meaning than any external recognition. Throughout many decades of his career, as the film industry changed, as trends and perceptions of artists constantly shifted, Andy Garcia still kept his true self, still did not let the pressures, the templates, or the expectations from Hollywood change his essence. A life that was not perfect, full of turns, disappointments, and things that were not complete, but he had never betrayed himself, had never sacrificed his dignity or personal principles in exchange for temporary glamour. That resilient existence, the quiet steadfastness that few saw, was exactly how he affirmed himself, how he proved that real value did not lie in standing at the peak or being recognized by the whole world, but in the ability to keep his whole self to every change, every challenge, every loss. Andy Garcia had turned each role, each project, each choice in his life into a part that proved that very principle, that even if not always evaluated fairly, even if not always prominent in the public's eyes, he was still an honest man, an artist loyal to his identity, a person whose contributions all carried depth, patience, and personal dignity. When looking back at the journey, the losses, the sacrifices, the loneliness he had carried throughout his life were not only voids, but also proofs of inner strength, of the steadfastness that not everyone could maintain. In the silence of the years, standing outside the center, in the moments when he was not recognized, Andy Garcia still continued to move forward, continued to contribute, continued to keep his identity and dignity, and that very resilience created a complete image, a symbol of a man living honestly, a life whose story, even if not perfect, was still proof that not every victory had to be seen. But the steadfastness and the ability not to betray oneself was the greatest success a person could achieve. And at the end of the journey, when looking back at what he had gone through, Andy Garcia did not need the light of the media or recognition from the outside world to affirm his value. Each step, each choice, each role, each moment of living honestly with himself was enough to prove that he was a man who had never lost himself. And that very thing made his story become a living legacy, a proof of dignity, identity, and resilient strength that anyone looking at it could feel, even if the world might never have seen it fully. The story of Andy Garcia is a poignant yet inspiring proof of how a person can resiliently move through losses, challenges, and prejudices, while still holding firm to his own identity and values. When looking back at his journey, from the childhood days when he had to leave Cuba, carrying a longing for his homeland that he could not name, to the early years stepping into Hollywood with countless rejections, being framed in stereotypical roles, one cannot help but feel compassion for a man who once stood on the edge, but was never fully placed in the center. The quiet efforts to prove his ability, the years of pouring his heart into the project, the lost city to tell the story of Cuba and family that he carried in his heart, then facing disappointment when the film did not receive the acceptance he expected, all showed a journey full of pain, but also containing extraordinary strength and will. The most admirable point was the way Andy Garcia chose to keep his identity and dignity, not chasing temporary fame or the templates Hollywood imposed, refusing temptations to trade his personal values, and instead building a solid family, living fully with his wife and children, and raising his kids with real presence. His story reminds us that in real life, especially in the United States, where success is often measured by fame, money, or prominence, real value lies in the ability to hold firm to oneself, keep one's principles, and stay true to what one believes is right, even when the world does not see or fully evaluate it. Andy Garcia is not someone standing at a brilliant peak, but it is precisely his resilience, honesty, and dignity in every step that is the profound lesson that every person, especially those seeking success and meaning, can learn and feel. If the story of Andy Garcia touches your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a way to remember a man who has resiliently kept himself amid losses and challenges. Thank you for following. See you again in the next video to explore more inspiring stories from people who dare to live true to themselves.